we had whale numbers, adults, that were as low, that we had not seen since 2002, and we had numbers of calves, the lowest that we had ever seen in our study. Now you can see down at the bottom, whales are in blue dots, calves are in red. You can see everything drops in 2016, a little bit of recovery in the next couple of years, but not much.
Scary.
And this is, at one point we were seeing 700 whales in 10 hours of observation. Some of the things that we noticed, during our time on the shore and on the water was, well, first of all, the obvious, where the hell are all the whales? And the next was, where are all the calves? It's like, I think we saw one calf that year.
Wow.
And we also saw lots of what we call skinny whales. Whales where you can visibly see the shoulder blades, which means they have a very thin blubber layer. They don't have the energy reserves. And those things made us start to think about, could this be prey related? Could this change in observed numbers be related to what's happening in Alaska where they go to feed? And I'm going to skip over some of the statistics. If anyone's really interested in it, come catch me later. But we're shooting for the median audience here. We looked at a number of climatic indices. These include the Oceanic Nino Index, Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, the North Pacific Oscillation Index, sea surface temperature. Skipping ahead to sort of the answer, we found the strongest relationships between observed abundances and this climate index called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. This has been previously tied to being a predictor, for example, the number of salmon in Alaska. And it seems to cover the whole Southeast Alaska region rather well, and since the majority of Hawaii's whales go to Southeast and Central Alaska, that seemed like that part made sense and made a decent study. And what I've shown here is a time history of the values, and positive red bars indicate a positive or warm PDO, and negative blue bars indicate cool waters or a cool PDO. And generally, cool waters are better for productivity because you don't have the surface layer, which prevents nutrient-rich water from reaching the surface. That's why upwelling regions tend to be very productive. You get lots of cold, nutrient-laden waters that come up right up to the surface, and it's like you've got fertilizer, you've got sunshine, you've got phytoplankton. And if anyone's been to Southeast Alaska, you know that the water there is green, not blue, at least in shallow areas. So just a simple plot, which is fairly convincing, is looking at our whale numbers and the phase of the PDO. And when there was a moderately warm PDO, we got a slow growth. Faster growth when it was cool, and when we get this really strong, most recent positive or warm PDO, we get this big drop. I'll just skip over the statistics, but what was really coming out was the Pacific Decadal Oscillation lagged 2 years, which is sort of saying like, okay, it indicates that they need good forage, a little bit in the future, so that they build up the resources and they have the blubber reserves to make the migration to Hawaii, or perhaps even have calves. And for the one statistical graph I will show is just showing that for both numbers of calves and numbers of animals, we're getting a nice association with high numbers of calves and adults with negative or cool Pacific Decadal oscillations, lagged 2 years. So just to summarize, the statistics are showing again, in 2016 our whale numbers plummeted. Our calf numbers were the lowest we'd ever seen since 2000. Our statistical analysis was showing the clear seasonal peak, the clear increase grossly over time. And again, this very strong relationship between PDO and whale abundance. And the last thing I want to do on this topic is just show you, again, the same values replotted, but with preliminary partial 2019 whale counts, showing an increase over the, definitely over the previous 3 years, both in numbers of adults and numbers of calves. Our observations are certainly that we're seeing a lot more calves than we have over the last few years. Still, we're seeing some skinny whales, so it's not back to the salad days of 2010, but at least, if you look at the last 4 years, the trend is encouraging.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there a risk that the skinny whales can't make it back to Alaska?
Yes, that is a very real hypothesis, very real likelihood.
Okay.
Because they have to swim 2,500 miles
With no food.
with no food and whatever they have left. I don't know enough about the topic to lay odds on whether or not they'll make it, but it's a real possibility.
Definitely, some of them that are skinny don't have enough reserve to make it.
It's certainly very reasonable. And
They're going to die.
the other thing I will throw out is or add to the story is Chris Gabriel, one of our founding members, works in Glacier Bay as the whale biologist up in Alaska, and over the last 4 years, she has seen a 59% decrease in the number of whales in Glacier Bay. And this is an area where they have tremendous site fidelity, and individuals had been seen for decades and decades, I think into the 40s of years, repeatedly coming back to that area, and several of them have just disappeared. Yes?
This may be a little too early to ask this question, but they've just fairly recently been taken off the endangered list.
Yes, in 2016,
Yeah.
which is
And
perfect
now,
irony.
yes, if they keep dropping, which we really pray that doesn't happen, are they going to be put back on it? Do you know?
That's the scientific community is concerned enough that additional meetings are being scheduled to discuss this. We are trying to take a closer look at it. We are trying to see if this is a blip that may be related to the poor forage. Like, for example, gray whales, when they came off the endangered species list, a few years after that, there was a big die-off that was related to lack of forage. And then they've since come back. It's really too early to tell, but the initial trend, the initial data since 2016 are certainly promising. I mean, we like numbers going up better than going down. If they continue to go up, I think then no, there will be no additional. I doubt there would be additional talk of putting them back on. Should they continue to go down, then I think it would be time to do so personally. Yes.
Real quick, is there any similar correlation between the Atlantic population as compared to the Pacific humpback population?
I really don't know. We've been hearing lots of stories about things changing at the Atlantic as well. For example, I know it's a completely different species, but it's the same prey base. The puffins are having a really hard time at the Atlantic because the sandlands, which is their preferred prey, which is a humpback prey item, just aren't there. And so the puffins are having a really hard time because their preferred prey is not present. So things are changing in all the oceans. Yes.
Is this total population or local population?
This is observed numbers for Kauai High Bay.
Oh,
Okay,
This is observed numbers for Kauai High Bay. What we can do is we can say we've got 18 years of data collected in the exact same way. So we've got a very good I believe we can argue that we have a very good feel for the trajectory, but that does not just scale automatically to the entire population. Sorry, Richard.
Adam, has anyone been doing studies on the amount of forage available in Alaska, whether that's been declining?
There have. Help me out this, but yes, I'm definitely, I've been hearing things. We have seen, again, in 2016, there was tremendous seabird die-offs. California sea lions were walking into restaurants looking for food. Literally. So lots of other predators in the same ecosystem were having difficulty. You want to add anything?
Well, only the really the commercially harvested species get all the attention from like the fishing game and the NOAA and everything. So no one really keeps track of the forage fish and those lower food chain animals that the rest of the ecosystem relies on. So there's not
The importance is
There's no money in it.
right. And nobody calling their congressman to say, hey, study these things.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but the whales are kind of the unlucky canary in the coal mine indicator, right? 'Cause they're very
Right.
conspicuous, they're very big, people care about them. So in a way, we're kind of lucky that the whales are showing us what's going on. One way.
Quick question.
Yes.
Have the humpbacks been showing up in unusual places like the coast of California and Monterey Bay that they had not frequented before in the last few years?
Not that I'm aware of.
Because I have friends live there and I dove Monterey Bay for many years and don't ever recall seeing a humpback there. Lots of grays, lots of occasional blue, lots of other species, but I have friends saying, "Oh yeah, we're watching the humpback whales in Monterey Bay."
I'd say humpbacks are usually pretty common off of Monterey. It's one of the places that people go for whale watching. They'll go to the Farallones, they'll see blue whales and humpbacks.
Really?
And so we just did a 5.5 month cruise that started off in Vancouver, ended in Baja, surveying the west coast of North America. And there were a lot of humpback whales. I mean, we usually on our NOAA cruises don't survey on the continental shelf, but we were tag teaming with there's not enough money to just run a marine mammal survey anymore, so there was not enough money to run a fish survey, so we did a fish and marine mammal survey together. And so we surveyed the shelf, and we had to increase the size of our sighting form because we'd never gone to 4 digits before. So our cruise had never gone to 1,000 sightings, and we went something like 1,800 sightings for our cruise. So and that's mostly because we're working on the shelf, and there were a lot of humpbacks.
That was recently?
I got off the ship in December.
That's recent.
So those
Okay.
would be what one would think those would be whales on their migration this
There's
way?
different clumps of humpback whales, right? So these guys go to southeast Alaska, and then in the Mexico group that kind of go up to California, and there's one from like Costa Rica that kind of feed off California as well. This is like the big expert.
Yeah, so there are different populations, and I mean, they're, seeing a 59% decline in 4 years is like, whoa, hopefully they found some other food somewhere else. I mean, they are very adaptable. Maybe they move somewhere else. People say, oh, there's more near California, British Columbia. So there's, possibility that they just smartened up and went somewhere else. But really those populations are genetically, determined, and so it seems like mostly they wouldn't change that, but we never know. And we'll know if they start coming back to Glacier Bay. And, I agree with Adam. I'm cautiously optimistic that the increase in Hawaii whales is really indicates they found food somewhere. So some whales somewhere are doing well.
And we did biopsy over 300 humpbacks, so they were trying to work up where their animals are from. But mostly they were thinking they were either from New Mexico or Costa Rica styles.
Okay. So I'm going to bring us back 20 minutes later to the start of what I'm supposed to talk about tonight.
That was fascinating.
But glad we got that out of the way. I've been working with humpback whales and sound for 35 years now. I literally started in '84 doing it as a sopping wet behind the ears assistant in Glacier Bay in '84 on a effects of vessel traffic study, which is really acoustics. And since I've graduated, I've been working for a consulting firm called Marine Acoustics, which is doing applied science, looking at the effects of sound, as well as continuing my work with HMMC, where I'm more interested in the natural sounds and how natural sounds are used and how the natural world is changing. So I just want to sort of take a walk through this whole topic and touch on some of the bigger issues. I mean, we could have a whole lecture series on this one topic alone, but then we'd have to charge you tuition and okay. So it will probably come as to no surprise to anyone in this audience, being fairly Akamai, that acoustics are the lifeblood of living in the ocean. Light doesn't travel far. Chemical traces are difficult over any distance, but sound travels fabulously well. And so most of the animals are going to have some sort of acoustic sense, even animals who can. Find the cursor, any cursor.
Wrong way.
So just a quick introduction to some of our favorite guys, and pardon me for overdosing on humpbacks, but
Who got that great photo?
Is that whale talking into the microphone?
It's open mic at the whale bar.
it's the photo that Flip Nicklin took, and I couldn't resist.
Of course it's a wonderful shot.
It's great. Remember the old Gary Larson cartoon? Louie Louie?
The far side, yeah. It's like, it's karaoke night. How far can that sound travel?
Well, that depends.
I've heard some big numbers, and I wonder if those are true.
Let me answer that question. Let's come back to that question
Okay.
later in the talk. There's a lot that goes into that answer. It's the little pulses.
I didn't know the fish made sounds too.
Oh, fish. Fish make a tremendous number of fish make sounds, and they make some really interesting sounds. And the more we look and listen to the ocean, the more we are finding that fish are making sounds. So even though they're small animals living in a fairly small world where light works, on the reef, they still have acoustic signaling. But then, of course, the fish and the whales don't have the ocean to themselves anymore. Okay, I don't have the audio that goes with that, but it's
That's okay.
basically
It's an explosion
implosion.
or implosion, okay.
And even though it says explosion, I obviously have to fix my slides. My apologies. So, so these seismic exploration pulses, the air guns, which are very much in the news now because of all the back and forth about the east coast of the U.S. on the mainland, where right before President Obama left office, he canceled all the seismic exploration and utilization off the east coast of the U.S., and the current administration has reopened that can of worms. So there are lots in the paper and lots of lawsuits about the topic. I should also introduce the idea of spectrograms to you. You're going to be seeing a lot of these. Time is on the x-axis. Frequency, which we hear as pitch, is on the y-axis. And the amplitude or the loudness of the signal is going to be represented by the brightness of the signal. So what we've got here is, this pulse. And there's actually, it's starting to curve here because of some propagation effects that I'm sure the physicists understand, and I'm not going to go into much now. But this is, 30 miles away. These are 300 miles away. And you can see they're still well above the background. So the ambient noise, so these signals are raising the background noise of the ocean, if you will. So this is an animation showing sort of what happens when one of these things goes off. You get these rings, each ring representing a separate airgun shot going out, and you can see we are talking, 5 degrees of longitude. It's going out quite some distance. And on the z-axis is the amplitude, also represented by color. But the idea is to try to just get across how loud these things can be and how far they can carry. And we also have the other thing that gets a lot of attention. And that's a recording of what's called the 53C anti-submarine warfare sonar. Or its primary function is anti-submarine warfare. So that's sort of an introduction to the natural and some of the man-made sounds that are in the ocean. There's plenty more. There's snapping shrimp, there's lightning strikes, there's earthquakes, volcanoes, all these things that sound to the ocean. So what I want to try to do is to talk about, again, what's in the ocean, what's naturally what we're putting into the ocean, what some of the effects might be. Try to get away from the idea that any noise is automatically bad. It's just not that simple. We're dealing with a biological system, which means it's complicated. And also talk to you about how some of the animals respond to some of the signals that go in there. So again, I've got this tutorial slide on just how scientists deal with sound, because humans are, like all good mini terrestrial mammals, we're primarily a visual creature. And so we do well, especially those of us who have not the best ears, do very well with visual representations of sound. So on the top panel is what's called a waveform. It's simply the alternating high and low pressure with time. And then on the middle panel is what's called a spectrum, which instead of having time on the x-axis is frequency. And here is amplitude. So what you're seeing here is there's this broad band of energy between 0 and 100 hertz. But if you look at the top panel, you can see it's changing over time. So just looking at all, where the energy is interesting, but we could know more. And so we get to these sonograms or spectrograms where we have time on the x-axis, frequency on the y-axis, and again, the intensity is sort of in the z-axis, and since we don't have 3D monitors yet, it's represented by the darkness. And so you can see it's a frequency sweep starting from very, very low, going up to about 100 hertz. So these are the visual representations you'll be seeing. I also need to spend a little bit of time talking about our good friend, the decibel. Because for the non-physicists out there you will read horrible things in the newspaper every day. And then there's the stories written about decibels, which are even worse. So I'm going to begin with a question. You're at a scientific meeting, which means you are in a large windowless room in an exciting city, and you're in a large windowless room. Sometimes I question the intelligence of scientists. But nevertheless, in this setting, it's announced it's 35 degrees outside. You haven't had enough coffee, so you've forgotten what city you're in, because you've been to so many meetings. It's 35 degrees outside. Do you wear a jacket or shorts?
We've got to find out if it's Celsius or Fahrenheit.
Yeah, we got a good crowd tonight. You'd be surprised how long it takes most audiences to come up with that.
I was about to ask that.
Like that, there are multiple flavors of the decibel. A decibel is defined as 10 times log base 10, the ratio of a measured intensity divided by a reference intensity. So to begin with, if you don't have a reference intensity specified, a dB number is meaningless. Somebody tells you this sound is 80 dB, they haven't told you nothing. They don't know anything. You should smack them. Lousy acousticians. But to begin with, using the standard reference levels, which is 1 micropascal in water and 20 micropascals in air, and because of the density differences of air and water, you may have noticed that before, there's a 62 dB difference between what we commonly talk about as sound in air and what we commonly talk about as sound in water. So right now, I'm probably at about 70 dB, read 20 micropascals in air. You know, a reasonable, slightly elevated, either obnoxious party guest or lecturer. Take your pick. If you were to put that in terms of water, we would be talking about 132 dB, 31 micropascal. It's the same sound level, but a very different number. So when you read garbage in the paper and says it's louder than, this sound they're putting in the water is louder than a jet engine, they probably don't know what they're talking about.
Because of the 62 dB difference.
Yes. I mean, we as the bioacoustic and acoustic community have been fighting this battle for 30 years and we have not yet won. Unfortunately, we're getting as many new reporters as we get new scientists. Okay, so traditionally, we tend to think about behavioral responses as scaling from, a behavioral response, like someone, you're in a quiet room and someone goes, you turn and look. That's a behavioral response. We'll talk about masking. We'll talk about temporary threshold shifts and permanent threshold shifts, the possibility of injury, and then some examples. I'm going to go backwards for no particular reason. When I started, now that I've got I have the advantage of having experience and perspective on how our thinking and our knowledge of this topic has changed over the years. Fortunately, for the most part, it's gotten better, at least we know more. But we always, people tend to think about dose-response functions. It's sort of like you give a little bit of stimulus, you get a little response. You give a lot of stimulus, you get a lot of response. That doesn't always work out so well for a behavioral response. Works great for drugs, physiological responses. There's a lot more going on in a behavioral response. To start with, what is the characteristic of the sound? Is it even something you can hear? We do a study, we could propose to do a study of, human responses to dog whistles. It's going to be boring, because none of us are going to hear, well, but for the most part, we're not going to hear the dog whistle. And, if you're studying a 75 kilohertz oceanographic signal, it may be, there are some animals that are just, it's going to have to be really, really loud for animals just to be able to detect it, because their hearing range is very different than the stimulus. Also, where is it? Is the source moving? Is it going on and off? How often is it going on and off? Is it regular? Is it predictable? All these things can affect how you respond to a sound stimulus. And that's just the source. Then it's got to deal with the environment. We've all, let's see, I presume everyone's been in the ocean enough that generally as you go down it will get colder. Right? That sort of thermocline, or very shallow thermocline, or the deeper thermocline, is that change in temperature changes the speed of sound. And when you change the speed of sound, light rays bend. And you've called refraction. And everyone's seen refraction. You throw a pencil in a jar of water. The pencil bends. That's refraction. So the structure of the water can cause light rays to bend, sound waves to bend and produce really interesting patterns of arrivals where you can have multiple arrivals. Sound arrives 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And then there's the background noise of the ocean itself. How loud is the ocean? Can you hear the sound? So it's like, sure, you can make humpback whale with an average source level of 172 dB or 1 micropascal broadband, can make a sound off Kauai High Harbor, and you might be able to detect it with a hydrophone array 100 miles away, but you're never going to hear it with your ear. Because the hydrophone array has got the signal processing that can pull the sound out of the background noise. So the level of background noise will all very much affect how far you can hear a signal. And Roger Payne and Doug Webb published a paper in 1971, 72, postulating that in the pre-industrial ocean, fin and blue whales are loud enough that an animal vocalizing off the coast of the Americas would be detectable to a conspecific off the coast of the United Kingdom. And the physics completely and totally back them up. That's to say it's possible. There's nothing in there that says just because you can doesn't mean that they did. But it was quiet enough where that was possible. That's no longer possible.
Because of the background noise?
Because we have raised the background noise. Okay. Then I mentioned just, the hearing ability of animals, but then we also have the fact that, animals are individuals. And some animals are more, some individuals are more sensitive to sound than others. They have different experiences. This has all been very well demonstrated. So in terms of source characteristics, is it loud enough to be heard? Can you hear this frequency? How often? How does the duty cycle effect, is it on constantly or does it cycle on and off? And then is the sound focused? There are animals and human created things that focus sound. Dolphins are a great example. They focus their echolocation beam forward to try to find fish. So the source level going this way is very loud, but over here, 90 degrees, is much, much, much less. So I mentioned a little bit about propagation. There are some simple geometric models. The red line represents spherical spreading, which is simply, or sometimes called 20 log R, and that's what you get in deep water when the sound just goes in all directions. The blue line is cylindrical spreading, which is in shallow water where it basically can't go up and down because it's shallow, and so it just goes this way, and it should drop off much less. And then reality is usually somewhere in the middle. That's, one simple model. This is a picture of what a sound field might look like in the real ocean. And these little yellow dots and white lines represent animals diving up and down in this sound field. And so I'm just trying to get across the idea that acoustic propagation in a real ocean can be very complicated. And it just makes the whole issue of looking at responses equally interesting. The other thing to talk about or realize is that not only is it range from the source to the receiver, but also the depth of the receiver. So this animal is fairly close to the source, which is in the upper left-hand corner, but it's in the pink water, which is really, really, really quiet. This animal twice as far away, he's getting the full dose. Or she, I don't know. It's just a computer dot. So, yeah. Listen. Okay, and then this lovely summary figure is called the winds diagram that I have a special connection to because this was published in November of 1962 in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, and I was published in November of 62 in a slightly lesser journal. And what it is a representation as a spectrum form showing sort of the level and sources of different noise in the ocean. So this black line is sort of the basement. And then we've got the blue lines represent wind noise. The higher the wind, the bigger the waves. Waves create bubbles, bubbles collapse, boom, wind noise. That's where the wind noise comes from. We've got bands for ships. We've got bands for earthquakes. So, a complex thing going on just to talk about what's going on in the ocean. And I've talked about this before, but I want to introduce the idea of audiograms. Has anyone ever had a hearing test? Okay, they're basically measuring your audiogram. What's your threshold at different frequencies? All mammals have this basic U-shaped curve. And down there at the bottom, that's what's called the frequency of best hearing. That's where you're most sensitive. And these are some sample audiograms for a variety of different marine mammal species. The yellow is the low frequency cetaceans for their best frequency. Best hearing is 1 or 2 kilohertz. The green are the mid-frequency cetaceans like dolphins, which is up in the 10 to 60 kilohertz regions. High-frequency cetaceans, up over 100 kilohertz. And then pinnipeds are sort of a mixed bag, and they have different audiograms for both in air and in water.
How do you get a whale to push the button that he heard that?
The low-frequency cetacean curve is extracted from the anatomy of the inner ear and informed by all the others. All the others are also based on anatomy and measurements, because you can train a dolphin to push the paddle and it hears the sound.
It's the whales are.
And a pinniped.
Yeah,
But I was just wondering if you could give them a pulse and see if they move or do respond to it or something like that.
Yeah, basically. Well, that's a response threshold, not a hearing threshold.
Yeah, that's what I could figure, how you can separate the two.
Good question, but it's a very long answer.
Okay.
Basically, the response threshold is going to be some dB above the hearing threshold, because or maybe not. For some stimuli, animals will respond at a 0 dB signal to noise ratio. Killer whale signals can produce gray whale. English is my native language. Gray whales will respond to killer whale signals as low as 0 dB signal to noise ratio.
Wow.
Which makes a lot of sense
Get the
because
hell out of there.
if you hear your primary predator, it's a good idea to go the other way. On the other hand, if it's a signal that may not have as much meaning, you may need much more of a received level before you create a response. So that difference, there can be a difference between hearing threshold and response threshold.
Effects of evolution.
Every day, everywhere.
What would a human hearing audiogram in water look like compared to those?
Question. I've never thought about and never been asked before. So I don't know.
How do you get people who are swimming to push the little button?
Usually they're Navy divers and they're being paid to be in the tank.
Right.
Because there have been hearing studies on Navy divers. I just don't know. I don't know the answer. If you're really curious, I can help you point you where to find the answer. But I don't know.
Good question.
Okay. So a really watershed moment in all of this was the publication of this one paper by Southall et al., which was an entire issue of a journal. To sum it up, they did a retrospective analysis looking at all the behavioral response work that had been done to date. And they ranked the responses on a severity scale. A small response like whoop, or a severe response like run away, run away, run away. And then they tried to predict the severity of the response based on the received level of signal at the animal. Again, with that simple dose response idea in mind. Absolutely no. That's what we're trying to look at. Absolutely no relationship between the received level and the severity of response. So that whole very simplistic idea of, some level of sound, it doesn't matter what kind of sound, is going to predict a certain level of response. That's just right out the window. So, hey, we're learning stuff. A follow-up concept, which was actually, I was one of the co-authors on the paper that this idea comes from, is that at low to moderate sound received levels, it's basically all driven by context. What is the animal doing? What is the type of sound? What is the animal's experience? All of those are going to be far more important than the received level of sound in determining its response. But at some point, when it gets really, really loud, then it seems like, yes, a dose response does take over at really high levels. But at low to moderate levels, we believe that there's a lot more involved than just how loud it is. And I'd like to show you a couple of examples. This is a data slide taken from a paper looking at the effect of low-frequency active sonar on gray whale migration. And this is a lovely experiment where we've got 10,000 gray whales migrating past. They're all going, for the most part, in the same direction, south. So everyone is naive. And in the top panel, the red dot represents the ship. And with the LFA signal on, there's an obvious offshore corridor and an inshore path. Nobody's going by the ship. Whereas in the control over there, where the ship's there, the speaker's in the water, but no sound is being produced, they're just going right by the ship. If you look at that, it's like, oh, they're avoiding the sound, which they are. And we can back calculate and say, okay, they start to avoid at this sound level, and we have our answer, and we go write our paper, and everyone's happy. Fortunately, there were some very clever people on this experiment, not me, who said, let's move the sound source to the edge of the migration path instead of putting it right in the middle. And they repeated that and turned it up a little bit so that the sound levels would be the same, and basically got absolutely no difference between sound on and sound off. Absolutely no difference statistically. So what we take away from this is, yes, if you put the sound right in front of them, they avoid it. If you put it right on the edge of their driveway, they could care less. Same sound, same amplitude, same naive whales. So it's not the sound level, it's where the sound was being presented that's making the difference. And again, with killer whales, everyone's favorite scary predator, people probably know that there's at least two flavors of killer whales. There are the resident fish-eating killer whales and the transient marine mammal-eating killer whales. And what they did was they started off by playing back signals of the transients and the resident killer whales to these seals, and then counted how many seals were on the surface afterwards. And so on the left, they played back the local transient signals, number of seals plummeted, went down by almost half. So you play the sound of their main predator, they hide. They played the sounds of the resident fish-eating killer whales. They could care less. Statistically, no difference. And then, in a nice control, they played back the sound of Alaska residents. This study was done in British Columbia. These are resident fish-eating whales, but the seals there had no experience with those calls. So, if you don't know what kind of killer whale is out there, it's probably a better bet to hide. And that's pretty much what they did.
Seals.
Sea evolution / Darwin Award.
Right.
And then this came up one day on my Facebook feed, and I just couldn't resist.
Oh dear.
To find, even in fish, we have distinct individual variation in how strongly animals will respond.
Bruce would like that.
So, hopefully I've gotten across the idea that, in terms of looking at behavioral responses, which is, the overwhelming response that we're dealing with, just because it covers a much larger area, there's a lot that goes into determining or predicting how an animal is likely to respond. But that's not all there is to the story. There are other things going on with sound in the ocean that I'd like you all to be aware of. I'm not really going to get into explaining all the physiological concepts and the measurements in acoustic masking, but everyone's been at a loud restaurant, like the one we were at last night, and it's hard to have a conversation. That's masking, plain and simple. When the background noise goes up, it's harder to have a conversation. That's all it is. And all these measurements are talking about how we measure that. Okay. So, marine mammals very rarely go to restaurants, with the exception of starving California sea lions. But they do live in the ocean, and that is their restaurant, and we have been barging in uninvited. And what this is a graphic representation of the sound characteristics of the vessels that we are putting out there. And you can see, we are talking spectral levels of 150, 160 dB. Those can translate into broadband levels, that is all the frequencies, for something like, a supertanker, up at like 195 dB, read 1 micropascal broadband RMS. That's louder than any blue whale. Well, that's right up there with the loudest of the blue whales. Humpbacks are about 175 at 1 meter. So, and these ships are about can be up to 195 at 1 meter. So we're putting a lot of noise into the ocean. So are humpbacks for that matter.
And that's continuous noise, right?
The ships themselves are operating continuously.
Right.
And but they are discrete sound sources. But when you get a lot of discrete sound sources distributed over a large area, it becomes a continuous rise in the background noise. And we seem to be very good at distributing ships in a fairly not uniform, but a fairly broad pattern across the world's oceans. And just as a reminder,
Oh, boy.
so if you get upset about shipping noise, and I hope you do, remember every gallon of gas that you burned came in on the barge. So we're also part of the problem. Humility. And perhaps more emphasis or reason for renewables. Anyway, the other thing is look at the northern hemisphere distribution, look at the southern hemisphere distribution of ships. And that's reflected. These are data from, these are decades old. And what it's showing is the ambient noise and low frequency with the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. 14, 15 dB difference. All of it due to those ships and the fact that there's lots in the northern hemisphere and relatively few in the southern. So you raised the issue of the continuity. Come on. Don't have the animation. So unfortunately what we have is a static map of some results of some work that I helped with for the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary off of Massachusetts. These parallel lines are essentially they are the shipping lanes for the traffic separation scheme that they're not required to use, and they've also shifted. These really large blobs are ships. Small little fireflies are whales. And you can see the range of influence that one of these ships has and compare it to the range of influence that the whales have. And you get a feeling for just how much of the acoustic world that a ship can take up. But we talk about communication space. That term has come up since the Payne and Webb paper of '72, where for fin whales the communication space was potentially the entire North Atlantic.
Are these measured data or simulations, or?
These are simulations based on measured data. So the ships have been measured, the ships' positions are real, the whales have been measured, the whales' positions are representational. Not every single whale's been tagged here, but this is where right whales live in the summertime. So another piece of work that I've been part of is looking at, for example, the loudness of a vessel over time and thinking about not only how loud it is, but how long are the periods between the stimuli? How much quiet time does an animal get? And this was for a study done in Glacier Bay where they're limited to 2 cruise ships a day, which compared to some other places is just nothing. And it's possible that animals can have hours of quiet time. So there is all these things that we've put into the ocean that raise the background noise. What do animals do? And there are some responses that animals can use to overcome this. First of all, they can simply speak up, which is what we do in a restaurant. And we call this the Lombard effect or the Lombard response, and it has been shown in a number of marine mammal species that as you raise the background noise, they will vocalize louder. So there's some ability to overcome that. You can also vocalize more. Just say the same thing over and over and over again. You have a better chance that the message will get through. If it's an intermittent noise, like those air gun signals, you might be able to time your vocalizations in between when the noise is occurring. Or if it's a continuous noise, like shipping, for the most part is, you might change your frequency to go into a quieter frequency. And we have seen all of these responses in marine mammals. Killer whales and a lot of other marine mammals have been documented to increase their call, the loudness or the volume of their call as the noise level goes up at about a 1-to-1 dB exchange rate. These are right whale calls that were recorded in the 50s and currently, the 50s for North America and 77 for South America, and then 2000 for North and South America. And you can see the earlier calls are lower than the more recent calls. So these right whales have shifted their frequency up to get out, presumably, to get out of that continuous low frequency band that is occupied by the vessels. And over on the right, you've got the statistics. But there is a limit to this. You can only be so loud, much to the appreciation of your neighbors. And this is some nice work that Susanna Blackwell did, where she was able to show that as the sound levels increased, bowhead whales were vocalizing more, but it got to the point where it got so loud they just gave up. They would increase up to a point. After a while, it's just, this is too much, and they just shut down. So you can have multiple responses. It's not just a single response. You have, okay, first you try this, and then, okay, I give up. And it's not just marine mammals. We talked about fish. People were surprised that fish make sounds. It actually turns out that the sounds of the reef itself may be reduced. Artificial noise on reefs, you reduce the amount of larval settlement. So, there are indications that, sound is affecting things up and down the whole animal kingdom. And we've now gotten into the point where, at the most recent effects of noise in the marine environment conference I went to, they were talking about clams and mussels and lobsters. And, saying, okay, we have measured this response in clams to sound. And we're all going, what? Yeah, pretty much.
How?
And we looked at their data and went, okay, but.
I don't know what the common screws are.
Yeah, you have to push buttons.
Okay, so, we've talked about, the responses. This is what it can lead to. This is a picture of the numbers of gray whales in San Ignacio Lagoon in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And basically from the late 50s into the late 60s, there was a salt mining operation there with lots of vessel traffic going in. And gray whales had been there for as long as anyone could remember. After a little while, they just simply stopped using this bay. It was apparently just too much noise. They left. And for a variety of reasons, the mining operation stopped. And after it stopped, after a couple of years, the whales returned. So that's sort of, the extreme behavioral response, completely abandoning an area. So we quickly talk about physiological responses, and then I think we'll call it a night, unless there's people are really dying to know more. So we now move from the behavioral responses into a physiological response. Okay, who here has gone, perhaps in their youth, to a club or a concert and woke up the next morning with ringing ears? Yes.
Still
We all have.
I think everybody.
Still there.
Yes. Well, okay, that's good too. If it goes away after, on the following day, that's what's called a temporary threshold shift. Basically, your ear hairs have gotten tired, and they are pissed.
Refusing to work.
Yes, that's it. So what you have is a temporary threshold shift. Your hearing gets worse. Your hearing gets worse. Your hearing threshold goes up because your ear hairs are tired. They have been overworked. But if you haven't overdone it too badly, the next morning everything is back to the way that it was. That's a temporary threshold shift. That can also become permanent if you do this often enough and enough and enough, or if you have really loud impulsive signals, or if you spend your entire life in a factory without wearing earmuffs. So what's going on is this is a normal ear, and those little V-shaped things are the hair cells or the cilia. And this is a similar one which the cochlea has been damaged by sound exposure, and basically the cells have been wiped out. And this is what happens to the 30 years in the factory with no earmuffs. All the places where you see gaps in the black, that's where the hair cells are gone, dead. And so basically this gentleman had significant frequency bands that he could not hear because of all the sound exposure. Okay. So that's sort of, the ultimate physiological effects when you're actually doing permanent damage to your hair due to chronic exposure. I think, given that it's 6:30, I think that's probably a good place to break.
What about the whales?
Well, we presume, since whales have fundamentally the same inner ear that we do, because they are terrestrial animals, terrestrial mammals that live back into the water, we presume that they have the same susceptibility that we do. Mm-hmm. And so that, yes, if you have a prolonged exposure to noise, you can have these kinds of effects. We know from captive dolphin studies that just like humans, as dolphins age, they lose high frequency hearing. So, they're subject to the same maladies that we are.
If they lose the high frequency, then does that affect how they communicate with other dolphins?
Most of their communication signals are relatively low frequency. The whistles, which are like 10, 20 kilohertz. It's really what they're losing is more sensitivity and echolocation. And what the effect that is on their livelihood is hard to measure in wild animals. But then you also have the fact that if you had a deaf dolphin that couldn't echolocate,
Right.
it's still living in a social group, a very tight-knit social group, and so the others might help it out.
survive.
Help them, and there might be more visual rather than just the audio.
Sure. You look at the South Carolina dolphins, and they're rushing fish up onto the sand mud banks.
Of more extreme physiological responses, such as those we've seen in some reef whale strandings.
Those are actually not extreme physiological responses.
Inner ear damage? Included by the U.S. Navy.
Oh, yeah. that one.
Okay. This is one of the 16 animals that stranded in the Bahamas in 2000. Here we go. So yes, beaked whales have been shown to defeat cursor buttons in Macintoshes. Beaked whales have definitely been shown to have a very strong sensitivity to mid-frequency active sonars. There is no doubt there has been a long history in the Mediterranean of beaked whale stranding, especially in Greece when the sonar exercises are done. In 2000, a U.S. task force went through Providence Channel in the Bahamas and left in their wake a wave of strandings, which really was the smoking gun. I will argue to the credit, the Navy immediately stood up and said, yep, we did it, and spent a lot of money trying to figure out why. And those efforts continue. And not long after that, the USS Shoup went through the San Juan Channel off the west coast of San Juan Island, where a good friend of mine has a hydrophone array. And they were using their 53 sonar, which is the signal that I played earlier. And there's a lot of whale watching out there, as you might well imagine. Everyone wants to look at the killer whales. And as the Shoup went by over about a 3-hour period, they were broadcasting with their ASW sonar. The people on the whale watching boats could hear it in air. The killer whales freaked out. There's no doubt. Extreme behavior, very strong behavioral response as this thing went by. They did a lot of work to try to make predictions on how loud the sound was at those animals, and the conclusions are pretty good that it was not loud enough to cause a TTS, certainly not loud enough to cause PTS, certainly created a very short-term effect, very little chance of any long-term effect. It was a 3-hour event, not a 3-hour tour, but a 3-hour event. But again, it really put the bullseye on the Navy.
In a situation like that, did they notice the whales? If the sound is bothering the whales, did they just go and stay on the surface? Because if they're on the surface, are their ears out of the water?
They're not out of the water, but they are in the pressure release zone, where because of when you're within the 4th wavelength of a free surface, where you have that huge density, you get a strong reduction in the receive level because the sound does not propagate well in that level. So that is actually one thing that you might predict if you've got a very loud, disturbing sound, is that animals would actually spend more time on the surface to get into that effective shadow zone.
Is there any evidence that the seismic testing would ever create these acute effects?
At short distances, yes, but at the same time, you can see animals at short distances apparently not responding to it. And again, when you get into behavioral responses, you get
A myriad of responses.
it can be a whole lot of things. It could also be that there's fish right there, and the animal's there because of the fish, and it's just tolerating the sound instead of not being affected by it. That's another possible explanation. So to get back to what you raised about the inner ear damage on the Bahamas whales, Darlene Ketton, who is the physiologist among all hearing physiologists, looked at the ears that came from those animals. She describes their behavior, or their condition is, in a human, it would have given them the worst headache you've ever imagined, but it was not fatal. And
But the reaction of the animal became fake.
stay with me. We're getting there.
Sorry, read the book.
I wanted to answer that one question before I got too far into the behavioral response study, which was started in 2007 in response to this incident and was a direct effort to try to understand how and why beaked whales were responding to these signals. And a tremendous amount of thought went into designing this experiment because at the time, they were basically saying, how do we experiment with something that is known to cause animals to die without killing animals? And that was very important. The first ones were done in a place called Autek, which is in the tongue of the ocean in the Bahamas. It has something like 65 hydrophones on the bottom. It's used by the Navy for Navy things. But it also is very good for picking up sperm whales, beaked whales, and dolphins. And so the way this experiment worked is they would go out and put a D tag, which is records the audio that is received at the tag on the animal, and also can measure, it's a 3-axis accelerometer, so it can measure pitch, roll, and dive, reconstruct the whole dive pattern in incredible detail.